Detective Raymond Carter, Sergeant Lucas Hale, and Lieutenant Mark Griffin, once feared, once untouchable, now sat frozen in a courtroom that no longer bent to their will. Their smirks had vanished, their confidence shattered, their hands trembling as the truth unraveled before them. The same system they had corrupted for years had finally turned its sights on them, and the woman they had dismissed as insignificant now stood at the helm of their destruction. The courtroom pulsed with an uneasy energy, the kind that came when justice felt predetermined. On one side, victims' families sat with weary eyes, their hope worn thin by years of disappointment. On the other, a group of uniformed officers leaned back in their seats, exchanging smirks and quiet chuckles. They had done this before, many times. The accusations against them, brutality, drug trafficking, even murder, had been serious, but the outcome had been predictable. The system bent for them, always. The lead prosecutor had presented a compelling case. Witnesses had come forward despite fear. There were photographs, bank records, even intercepted messages that hinted at a vast criminal enterprise hidden beneath the badge. Yet, when the verdict was read, it was the same as always: not guilty. A collective sigh of despair swept through the victim's side of the courtroom. Meanwhile, the officers barely bothered to suppress their celebration. One of them, a decorated lieutenant, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if amused by the whole process. Another clapped his partner on the back, as if congratulating him for another victory over the so-called justice system. As they walked out, they didn't hide their glee. Years of covering their tracks had made them untouchable. They had learned the weaknesses in the system, the prosecutors who hesitated, the judges who owed favors, the officers who knew better than to speak against their own. Their power wasn't just in their badges. It was in the fear they instilled, the silence they enforced. They had buried evidence, threatened witnesses, and manipulated reports with surgical precision. Even when the media stirred up public outrage, it never led anywhere. Investigations opened and closed, protests came and went. The machine kept running, and they remained in control. Outside the courthouse, reporters threw questions at them. One officer, barely hiding his smirk, held up his hands in mock innocence. "Justice was served," he said before ducking into a waiting SUV. The others followed, disappearing into the city they had long controlled from the shadows. They weren't just police officers, they were enforcers of their own law, their own rules, answering to no one. And if anyone tried to come after them, they made sure they never tried again. Back inside, the families of the victims sat frozen in grief. A mother clutched a framed photograph of her son, her fingers trembling. A father shook his head in silent rage, jaw clenched so tightly his teeth could have cracked. They had trusted the law, believed that this time things would be different. But as always, those in power had walked free, laughing, untouched. The city simmered with anger, but the officers didn't care. They had won. Again. They celebrated that night, raising glasses to another case buried, another scandal dodged. What they didn't know was that their time was running out. Someone had been watching them, waiting, preparing. Their celebration was premature. Their downfall had already begun. The news spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across the city. Social media erupted with fury, activists flooded the streets, and families of the victims demanded answers. But nothing changed. It never did. The officers at the center of it all carried on as if nothing had happened, confident in their protection. They had seen this cycle before: public outcry, media coverage, then silence. They weren't worried. They had the right people in their pockets, the right safeguards in place. What they failed to notice was that the system they had manipulated for years had begun shifting beneath them. Someone had been watching them long before their latest case reached the courtroom. Their crimes had been recorded, not just in redacted reports and buried testimonies, but in sealed federal documents, in classified investigations they never even knew existed. For years, someone had been pulling the pieces together, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment was coming. Within high-ranking circles of law enforcement, whispers of a major shakeup had begun. The FBI was preparing for something unprecedented, an operation designed to dismantle corruption from within. A new director had been appointed in secret, their identity kept under strict security clearance. The name wasn't released to the media. Even top officials had been left in the dark. But those who knew the truth had already begun to fear it. The officers, drunk on their victory, remained oblivious. They went back to their routines, patrolling the same streets they had poisoned with their corruption, collecting money from criminals they were supposed to arrest, intimidating those who dared question them. They didn't know that wiretaps had been placed in their precinct, that undercover agents had infiltrated their ranks, that their most trusted allies were feeding information to federal investigators. They didn't know that the walls were closing in. Across the city, in an undisclosed location, a task force worked in silence. Their mission was clear: take down the officers who had treated the law as their personal weapon. Surveillance footage was analyzed, financial records dissected, witness testimonies compiled into a damning case. But even as the operation neared its final stages, there was one detail that remained hidden from the public: the identity of the one leading it all. The officers believed they had outsmarted everyone, but they had underestimated the one person who had been studying them from the beginning. She had once walked among them, unnoticed, dismissed as another face in the system they thought they controlled. They had ignored her, overlooked her, failed to see the threat she posed. That was their first mistake. Their second was believing they were untouchable, because while they had been celebrating, she had been preparing. While they had been erasing their tracks, she had been documenting every step. And soon they would realize that the woman they had once ignored would be the one to bring them down. The summons arrived without warning. Each officer received a formal notice demanding their presence at the courthouse, marked with the unmistakable authority of the federal government. The wording was vague, but the urgency was clear. This wasn't a routine hearing. This wasn't an internal affairs review they could manipulate. It was something bigger. But they had faced inquiries before and walked away untouched. There was no reason to be concerned. They arrived in their usual manner, confident, composed, untouchable. Their lawyers walked beside them, prepared for yet another legal performance. Inside, the courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight. The air felt heavier, the stares from those in attendance sharper. Something was different this time, but they couldn't quite place it. At the prosecution's table sat a woman they didn't recognize, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She barely acknowledged them as the judge entered and called the session to order. Then the first indictment was read. It wasn't just misconduct. It wasn't just excessive force. It was something far worse: racketeering, conspiracy, federal corruption charges under the RICO Act. The words struck like a hammer, erasing the smugness from their faces. This wasn't about a single case. This was about all of them. Their entire network of crime, their years of cover-ups, their financial dealings with organized crime. The evidence had been laid out in devastating detail. Recorded conversations, financial statements, falsified reports, testimony from officers they once trusted. Everything they had buried was being unearthed, piece by piece. Some of them shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, looking for reassurance. But there was none. This wasn't a local matter where they could pressure a judge or intimidate a witness. This was federal, and the room was filled with people who had come to see them fall. Then, the final blow came. The judge cleared his throat, glancing toward the prosecution's table. A new voice was about to be heard. The lead investigator behind the entire case had personally authorized the charges, someone powerful enough to oversee the dismantling of their entire operation, someone they had never expected. The back doors of the courtroom swung open. The sound of heels clicking against the polished floor echoed through the silent chamber. The officers turned, and in an instant, their world shifted. They knew her. They had seen her before, but not like this. She walked to the front of the courtroom with measured steps, the weight of her authority crushing the air around them. The new FBI director. Their new FBI director. The same woman they dismissed years ago, ignored, underestimated. It was only then that realization dawned. The trap had been closing around them for years. They had celebrated too soon, believing they had won. But they had been played, and now for the first time in their lives they understood what it meant to be truly powerless. The room seemed to shrink as she took her place at the front. The weight of what was happening pressed down on the officers, their confidence unraveling with each passing second. The woman they had once disregarded, the investigator they had barely acknowledged, now stood before them as the highest ranking law enforcement official in the country. Memories crashed over them like a tidal wave. She had been there before, years ago, quiet, observant, unassuming. She had walked among them, listening, studying, taking note of every corrupt deal, every falsified report, every crime they had hidden under layers of bureaucracy. Back then, they had laughed off any threat she posed. She was just another investigator, another face in the system they controlled. Um, but she hadn't been watching them to build a single case. She had been building something bigger, something they never saw coming. She had spent years gathering evidence, though, connecting the dots they thought they had erased. Every victim silenced, every piece of evidence manipulated, every judge or prosecutor they had influenced. It was all mapped out, documented, and sealed into the case now laid bare before them. As she stood at the prosecution's table, her presence spoke louder than any words. The officers, once untouchable, now sat paralyzed in their seats, their world crumbling under the weight of the truth. The courtroom doors remained guarded, federal agents stationed at every exit. There was no escaping this. The indictments weren't just a list of charges. They were a death sentence for everything they had built. They had operated under the belief that no one could stop them, that their power was absolute. But the woman standing before them had outplayed them all. She had waited in the shadows, allowing them to believe they were safe, allowing them to grow comfortable in their arrogance. The silence stretched as she surveyed the men who had once ruled over the city with unchecked authority. They had used their badges as shields, their power as a weapon, but now those same badges meant nothing. They were no longer officers of the law. They were criminals, exposed in the harsh light of justice. One of them, a veteran lieutenant who had been at the center of nearly every scandal, swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, sweat forming along his hairline. Another officer, younger but just as deeply entrenched in the corruption, darted his eyes toward the exits as if considering whether to run. But there was nowhere to go. The trap had closed. The gravity of the situation settled over them like a suffocating weight. This wasn't another investigation they could laugh off. This wasn't another trial they could manipulate. The system they had controlled for years had finally turned against them. And standing at the helm of their destruction was the woman they had underestimated the most. The walls had finally closed in. The officers who once walked with unchecked power now sat frozen, their faces pale, their bodies rigid. The reality of their downfall was no longer something distant or theoretical. It was here, unfolding in real time, and there was no escape. The judge's voice cut through the silence, announcing that arrest warrants had been issued for all of them. Each name was read aloud, each charge stacked upon the last like bricks sealing their fate. The weight of their crimes, once brushed aside so easily, now crushed them under its full force. Federal agents moved in. The first officer, the one who had always been the loudest in his arrogance, was pulled to his feet. His hands trembled as they were yanked behind his back and locked in handcuffs. The sound of the metal snapping shut sent a ripple through the room. The others followed, one by one, their bodies stiff, their mouths suddenly unable to form the protests that once came so easily. Reporters outside the courthouse scrambled to capture the moment. Cameras flashed, microphones pushed forward, desperate to catch a glimpse of the men who had once ruled the city's streets like kings, now reduced to prisoners. The same courthouse where they had once walked free, laughing at the system they manipulated, was now the place where their power crumbled. Some of them hung their heads, their minds racing through the years of cover-ups and betrayals, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Others clenched their jaws, still in denial, unwilling to accept that they had been outmaneuvered, that someone had finally outplayed them. But the truth was undeniable. The woman they had ignored, dismissed, and underestimated had been the one to bring them down. She had studied them like predators study their prey, waiting for the exact moment to strike. And now, as they were led past her in chains, they couldn't even look her in the eye. The crowd outside erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps as the officers were loaded into transport vehicles. Victims' families, once silenced by a system that had failed them, now watched justice unfold. Some wept. overwhelmed that the people who had destroyed lives were finally answering for what they had done. Others simply stood in stunned silence, trying to process the reality of it all. As the last officer was shoved into the van, the new FBI director turned away. Her job wasn't finished. There were still more layers of corruption to tear down, more hidden crimes to expose. But this moment was the beginning of something bigger. The system that had protected these men for years had finally been forced to change, and the ones who had celebrated their victory in court just weeks before were now the ones drowning in fear, knowing that no matter how powerful they once were, justice had finally caught up with them.